One of the laziest criticisms I've seen of Sinners and Michael B. Jordan's performance specifically is this idea that not enough work was done to differentiate the characters of Smoke and Stack. I want to talk about all the work done at a technical level, but first I want to talk about what Michael B. Jordan was actually doing here to differentiate the three unique performances he gives in the film. I'll start with the basics of a dual performance, which to me are physicality and voice. First things you'll notice if you're actually watching Sinners is that the two voices here are not alike at all, and that's because Michael B. Jordan was working with a dialect coach who helped him craft two distinct voices based off two different starting points. Starting point for Smoke's voice was a recording of a man from the early 30s. Starting point for Stack's voice was actually an older black woman. That recording was from towards the end of the decade. Conversation about the voice can be tied directly into a conversation about the actual physicality of the performance. Stack's cadence is completely different. He generally is talking in a higher pitch and he generally is talking faster. Really notice this stuff with the way that Stack holds his mouth and his jaw, the way it moves when he's talking, because everything about it is looser. While with Smoke, everything around his mouth and jaw is tighter and more reserved, and that carries into the way he actually speaks, his vocabulary, the phrases he uses. Stack likes to kind of speak more. Smoke is very direct, very blunt, and very to the point. You see a lot of this character work done in the first hour or so of the film. Even in the conversation with Hogwood, you see what I'm talking about. Stack is kind of smiling and he says to him, "We have grown man money," says it in a kind of a big expressive way, and then he's reaching for his weapon and says, "and grown man bullets." It's into another interesting conversation. I've seen a lot of people label Stack as the bad twin, right? The little brother who's kind of out of control, and I don't think that's really fair. I don't think either of these men can be labeled as good or bad. I think the nuance is a lot more interesting. But when you think about the bad twin, you might think about the more violent one, which is undoubtedly Smoke. Feels like you're watching a big brother kind of shield his little brother from some of that pain. Even in their introduction, the scene with the snake, it's Smoke that actually takes the life of the snake. Seen in town, it's Smoke who without hesitation pulls his weapon and fires around into the leg of one of the thieves. Scene is a really good example of another difference between Smoke and Stack, the way they physically move. Michael B. Jordan wore shoes that were a little bit too big for Smoke, which causes him to slow down, to really settle, and to move with purpose. Meanwhile, with Stack, he wore shoes that were a half size too tight. He's fidgety, he's moving around a lot. It's more of a quick talking, quick moving performance. See him use those people skills to get what he needs from people. For Delta Slim, he's able to use his love for alcohol with the beer from Chicago to talk him in to coming to work for them. With Cornbread, he kind of manipulates him as well. And his dynamic with Sammy is a lot friendlier than Smoke. Smoke, I think, loves him and looks at him as a little brother, but it's more protective, it's more stern. With Stack, he kind of treats him more as a friend. First conversation between Stack and Sammy in the car when it's just the two of them is really interesting because Stack's kind of talking about sex. He's talking about how fast the car can go. He's having fun. He's laughing. And then Sammy says something serious. He asks, "What happened with your father?" It reveals something that plays into the conversation about violence I was just having. It's actually Smoke that took their father's life. I feel like Smoke's probably been absorbing a lot of violence and pain throughout their life, maybe doing things for the mob that he could do so his little brother didn't have to do them. Fun elements of the story is the way you see the Chicago mob reflected in the way they dress. With this being a classic Italian look, you think about people like Al Capone, who they worked for, and Lucky Luciano. This is the look with the fedora. It's with the character of Stack. He's put in the time, he's put in the blood, sweat, and tears. He's willing to broadcast, hey, I have money. He wears a lot of jewelry. He's very flashy. It's a big persona and a big performance. Over at Smoke, this is someone who still looks great, looks like he has it all together, but there's no silk suit, there's no pocket square, there's no tie, there's no fedora. Everything is practical. Very nice wool ensemble that kind of would fit in better in Chicago or in Ireland or England. Wearing a patty cap, which is popular with the Irish, the Welsh, the Scottish, they all kind of have their own version, but that's the look he's going for. So you kind of have an Irish look and an Italian one, which again is funny because they're coming from Chicago. Both kind of running from their past with organized crime, but they were able to rip off both sides, which is kind of how they're able to set up the juke joint. These are different characters in voice, in physicality, in the writing of Ryan Coogler, which is fabulous. They're very different in terms of their makeup. Go watch this video from Sean Richards, which is very interesting. She was the makeup designer, kind of lays it all out. It's about there being a heaviness in the way she did the makeup for Smoke. That's also reflected in the performance. For example, Stack has dimples, Smoke does not. That is how Michael B. Jordan is like holding and contorting his face, I think, in addition to the makeup during the performance. As many have talked about, Smoke is dealing with shell shock from World War I. He is dealing with PTSD. One of the reasons in that opening scene and throughout the film, he cannot roll his own cigarettes. Stack is the one who rolls it for him because his hands shake. They are steady, though, when he has a weapon. It's a very practical view on the world where he views weapon and wealth as power. Stack has kind of a looser and more free worldview. That's reflected in their disagreements about how to run the juke joint. Stack wants to kind of let people slide, let people pay a little bit less. Smoke is saying, we're running a business here. This has to be profitable. All of these differences are also reflected beautifully in their romantic dynamics. First kind of romantic scene we get in the film is actually at the railroad. We see Mary and Stack have a conversation. The first conversation they've had since basically Smoke and Stack left for the war. Then they went went straight to Chicago, and Mary and Annie are kind of left high and dry. The conversation is really interesting. To that moment, we haven't seen Stack have much interest in having serious conversations, and when Mary kind of confronts him, he doesn't even really make eye contact. Find out the why behind that later on in the film. Essentially, the very next scene after that is getting to see Smoke go back to the grave of his child, which is outside the house of Annie. This is very different than what we just saw at the railroad. Mary and Stack are both very flashy. They like expensive things. They have kind of this loud, boisterous, passionate, toxic, very sexual dynamic. I think there is some real love there. This feels like something deeper than that. This is real pain, real love, real passion. Annie pulls out a blade on him, but they are having this really deep conversation looking right into each other's eyes, and they're talking about the death of their child and how things have been since. I feel like there is more respect, history, and understanding here. We get a really interesting character moment for Smoke and a great moment for Annie as well, where Smoke kind of positions himself in a way that will pop back up later in the film. He is a skeptic towards anything that is magical, anything that is not tangible. He's been through so much pain, so much terrible stuff. He just wants to trust what he can see and feel. And we get this really cool moment where Annie basically says, hey, this was hoodoo actually keeping you alive. And as she's talking about that, the kind of background changes, there's noise, it feels different in that scene. It's really, really cool stuff that you might have missed on your first watch. You'll see that she gave Smoke a mojo bag that he's still wearing on him. All these romantic dynamics will weave together later on in the film. There's a poignancy to these white vampires who kind of represent the death of all culture biting Mary, and then Mary bites Stack, and then Stack is the one that ends up biting Annie. Annie is the character in the film with the greatest sense of cultural grounding, who is most confidently and spectacularly herself. Stack by means of Mary biting her, and then it's Smoke who once again has to do something horrible, something really violent, something really painful by taking her life. All this careful character work in the first hour 15 of the film that makes that last hour, makes all the action and stuff actually have emotional bite behind it. I think there are a lot of lazy ways to label these characters. I think people call Stack the more impulsive one or whatever, but when you actually hear them talk in the juke joint, you see his actual feelings, which is that Mary is not safe with him because of the racial dynamics at play in their surroundings. While the way that all was handled was unfortunate, he was trying to think about Mary's best interests at heart. And Smoke as more good or even-tempered, but Smoke is the one that is often very quick to violence. Violence in the film is basically always earned, but I think Stack presents himself as perhaps the more dangerous and flamboyant one, but Smoke is actually the person you need to watch out for between the two. He has a nose for bullshit. For example, when the vampires first come to the juke joint, Stack is kind of enjoying their song. He thinks about letting them in if they're able to pay, and Smoke knows exactly what's up. He thinks something is wrong and he trusts his gut. Despite everything Smoke has been through, despite killing his own father, despite World War I and all the violence in Chicago, all the pain, losing his child and losing Annie, in this moment there's still something soft there. We see him say basically, you know, I love you and I miss you. We see he has a really deep connection with her, and the romantic involvements of both of these characters are very interesting. The video is already far too long. I didn't even get to really talk about it. Michael B. Jordan is giving 3 performances in this film, not 2, because the vampire version of Stack is kind of everything about Stack turned up to 1,000. What's really interesting is I don't think we see Stack commit a single violent act in the film until this moment. That to say, I've barely touched on half of it, but if anyone does not think this was a great performance, please send them this video and ask them their thoughts.